Welcome to the Layman Seminary. I'm continuing my debate preparation series for my debate that's February 4th with Travis Thomas, I think his name is. I keep mixing up his name. But anyway, so I'm just going to do a little bit of reviewing at the very beginning. This slide right here summarizes what we've done in the previous video. Basically, we showed that the Hebrew word aman and batak are not synonymous. The supposed root of pistis and patho, which is pith, are not synonymous. So what that basically means is that pistuo and patho are not synonymous. So you basically have a distribution in how the word functions. So in other words, you basically can't use patho and the Hebrew word batak to read it into pistuo, the word for belief. Okay. Now, today we're going to be talking about grammatical issues, but I want to remind you of this. So the first 4 videos dealt with lexical studies, word studies, okay? We went through all of that. The 5th one dealt with syntactical studies, and now we're going into grammatical issues. And the grammatical issue that we're going to be talking about is verbal aspect and time force, because this is what's involved when you're talking about verbs. And it's a weighty issue. In fact, we kind of mentioned it a little bit in previous videos. So you could say that a Greek verb essentially has these 3 main components. It has more, but tense, mood, and voice. So basically, we're going to focus on how tense and mood work together, and all of that. Basically, there's the functional elements of a verb are aspect and time. Aspect is the portrayal of action. Is it in progress, the results, or just making a simple notation of occurrence? Now, here's Wallace's Greek grammar, Beyond the Basics, and he's talking about action start and aspect right here, what it is. So, Che brought this up. That's the primary book that we're going by as we're doing this preparation. So he's basically, there's the idea of portrayal of action. So time is when the action occurs. Wallace says that aspect is more important than time when you're talking about verbs. So you can see here, in general, tense in the Greek involves 2 elements: aspect, kind of action, sometimes called action start, though a difference does not need to be made between the two. Well, other grammarians nowadays say there is. And time. Aspect is the primary value of the tense in Greek, and time is secondary if involved at all. So lordship salvationists, regardless of whether they're Calvinists or whether they're on the Arminian side, argue for continuous belief based on present tense of pistuo normally. And so they often confuse time and aspect. And this is something I've talked about, ironically, time and time again. It's been one aspect of my informal debates on SOT's channel as well as my formal debates. It comes up often. All right, so this is how it works. John Doe is presently believing, and it's implied that he will continue in this state. That's the type of stuff you hear all the time whenever they see a present tense verb. They say that that's implied. But one thing you have to understand is that most grammarians agree that, except for Stanley Porter, I think, that there's no time outside of the indicative mood. Okay, so when we're talking about the Greek present tense, it can actually refer to the past, present, or the future, and context has to determine what's going on there. And I didn't make this description of things. I think I would describe things a little bit different, but I'm just trying to visualize what Chase said. So moving forward, belief in aorist tense is a statement of simple occurrence with no respect to duration, and the indicative is used for normal past time. So whenever, according to this claim, when belief is used in the aorist tense, it's just a simple statement that it happened, not making any reference to duration. Okay. Well, here's David Black's It's Still Greek to Me. We used his first year grammar when I took the seminary formerly, and I've read this one. It's pretty good. But this is what he says about the aorist tense. The word aorist, as we have seen, means unlimited or undefined. It was given the tense by grammarians to denote that the action spoken of is to be regarded simply as an event without any regard to the time in which it occurs or the length of time during which it has been going on. So what I did was I did a search for pisteuo in the New Testament in the Greek. And as you can see right here, the word occurs most in the Gospel of John. It occurs 98 times, in fact. Okay. Well, I wanted to narrow that down a little bit more. And it took me a while to figure out how to do this. I tried different tools within Logos, and I had to go with the concordance tool to do it. And the concordance tool is not the same thing as like a Strong's or something like that. No, you can search for things down to the tense, then everything. One day I'll demonstrate it. But when I narrowed it down to the aorist, that dropped down to 32. Okay, that's 32 for the Gospel in John. So 32 with the aorist. I'm like, wait a minute, we can narrow. That sounds about right. But now, Che suggested we look at the subjunctive. So then it narrows down to 12 times here with the subjunctive mood, the mood of probability, as it's called. So he brings up this passage from John. He came as 1:7, I think it is. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. Now, this is an aorist subjunctive indicating the go of things. Now, if this argument about continual belief was so correct, then why doesn't this passage right here use the present tense? Why is it using the aorist? Well, there was an article actually in a journal called The Abused Aorist by Frank Stagg, and he talked about a lot of different people that have abused the aorist throughout time, grammars and stuff like that. And you can get it at just type in abused aorist Frank Stagg, and you'll get to biblicalstudies.org.uk, and you can get it there. Another resource that Che mentions here, he starts mentioning some other older grammars that agree with them. He mentions Dana and Manti, which is pretty old, and they don't even have that in Logos, but I have this copy. And so he's talking about the different ways the present tense can be used. Just basically emphasizing it's not just continuous habitual like a lot of people try to say it is. Okay, here's a really old one. Idiom Book of New Testament Greek by Mull. It's not in Logos as well, but you can go to archives if you want to read that as well. Now, this one I do have in Logos. It's an older one. A Grammar of Greek New Testament in Light of Historical Research by A.T. Robertson. Okay, so anyway, we go to this page right here, and he says it's the present for present time. It has already been seen that the durative sense, in other words, a continuous sense, does not monopolize the present tense, though it does more frequently denote linear action. The verb and the context must decide. So this is an old school grammar saying what we need to know. And what's sad is a lot of people nowadays are that are teaching Greek, or at least saying Greek, and they're preaching or teaching on YouTube and stuff, are not saying all of the information that we need to know to make a decision. Well, another guy named David Matheson, who wrote an intermediate grammar that came out a couple years ago, wrote an article in 2013 kind of going off of Stagg's idea, except this is the abused present tense. And so he goes through all the ways that the present tense has been abused in Greek grammars and resources and all of that. Well, it's actually in the Bulletin for Biblical Research. And there's the actual article right here. I guess it's Denver Seminary. So this is what this is the conclusion of it. Any notion of continuation or ongoing action can only be included if there are clear cues within the context that these meanings are in fact present. But these notions do not belong to the present tense form itself. In addition, the interpreter should ask whether the present tense functions to highlight or add discourse prominence, particularly in contrast with the aorist tense form. Outside of this, it would be better if the interpreter avoided making any specific exegetical and theological claims based on the present tense. And when looking for grammatical help for understanding the present tense, we should rely on the most recent grammatical tools. Well, Kevin from Kevin Biblical Discussions and I, about a year ago, we did a video on John 5:24, and I did a lot of this presentation, and I particularly talk about the abused aorist and the present tense in this video, and how people are twisting up John 5:24, 3:18, 3:16, other passages like that. So y'all may want to check that out. Now, in a BibSec journal article, right here, we have Daniel Wallace critiquing that Stagg article. And I'm sorry, and the Matheson article. And this is what Wallace says. Because Matheson was critiquing Wallace in his article as well. And so now Wallace is critiquing him back. He said, Matheson rightly shows what the aspect of the present tense by itself means. What he generally fails to do, with some interesting and illuminating exceptions, is to note the pragmatic effect of combining aspect with action start as legitimate categories of present tense usage. Thus, although overall his essay is a good corrective to abuses of the present tense, his minimalistic approach is also deceiving, since it does not take into account how real present tense verbs behave in various contexts. And I can understand what Wallace is saying about that, but the problem is that you'll see as we interact with Wallace's grammar and some others, that there's certain passages that are assuming certain theological things, and that's what's driving their choices. Okay, so Che says that he heard Wallace talking about in class or whatever say this. John's tendency is to use a progressive or completed tense, imperfect. I think this should be incompleted, not completed. Imperfect, present, or perfect for a belief which leads to salvation. Like, for example, John 3:16, present participle. But he uses an undefined or particular aorist for belief which stops short of true salvation or genuine salvation. Can't remember how it says. So he's making the argument that its progressive idea is genuine salvation, but the aorist stops short of true salvation. That's a theological statement. So in evaluating this, is it always true? Is it normative? Is it valid? Okay, so Wallace has also made a shorter grammar, the basis of New Testament syntax, intermediate Greek grammar. He made this so that students can just carry it around. It's not as bulky, and they can get to the main syntactical categories. So right here, this passage talks about everyone looks at a woman. Pasa blepon gunaka. So blepon is continuous action substantival participle here, or attributive participle, if it depends how you look at pas. It doesn't mean continually looking or habitually looking any more than the 4 verses later. Everyone who divorces his wife means repeated divorces. So here's Wallace agreeing that the present tense doesn't always indicate this habitual continual aspect. But then he mentions this about nomic statements, habitual, and all that. We're going to deal with that in a little bit. So yeah, this is where he's in his grammar. He's talking about that. So this is from the larger grammar. Okay. So in Mark 6:14, the word that's used to describe John the Baptist is a present participle, John the Baptizer. But it doesn't mean John, the one that's continually baptizing. So, and see, you can see right there, ha baptizon. And so they're bringing this up, and so third, the aspect of the present participle can be diminished if the particular context requires it. Thus, for example, habitozon in Matthew 1:4 does not mean the one who continually baptized, but simply the baptizer. Third, the aspect, I already said that. All right. So David could be described as the murdering one, but that doesn't mean that he's continuing and habitually in action of murdering. The attributive participle says nothing about continuation or repetition, but it sounds like Wallace reverses himself on the next page in certain parts of his grammar. So this is a video I made 2 years ago whenever I took Advanced Greek 1, and this was a presentation that I did. Well, this was the rough draft for my presentation, a verbal aspect of the substantive participle. It's only 14 minutes long. You can go look at it. Now, here's the actual paper. Here's the structure: identifying and interpreting the participle, major categories, moving away from confusing categories, the verbal side of a substantive participle, time relation, action, and verbal aspect, grammarians on the presence and absence, and an exegetical dilemma, which is from 1 John 5 in the conclusion. So I'm not going to go through all of this. It may come up later on, but I just want to mention my thesis and a few other things. Does the Greek substantive participle convey a verbal aspect? Greek grammarians address this question, but their answers are not as clear as they could be. Since all grammars leak and there's no such thing as an ideal grammar, this paper will survey how grammarians interpret the substantive participle's presence or absence of verbal aspect. So action start and verbal aspect. Action start and verbal aspect are the most significant parts of verbals because no one disputes these concepts, even though grammarians often interchange these different terms. Action start refers to the type of action that occurs, while the verbal aspect refers to the action's viewpoint. Robinson discusses action site under the aorist tense of the participle. Grammarians on the present and absence of verbal aspect. Analyzing participles includes asking whether the participle has a perfective, imperfective, or stative aspect. It is assumed that all participles all have a verbal aspect, but some grammarians believe that in some situations the verbal aspect is absent or reduced. That's actually quoting Wallace. Hence, there's a continuum between the adjectival side and the adverbial side of the participle. Confusion has occurred in the past as early grammarians attempted to articulate their treatment of the substantive participle. While Wallace is a significant step forward from those early grammars, this is where it's talking about Wallace right here. Let me go to the next. His treatment of the substantive participle is still confusing in some places. He appears to have the continuum in mind when discussing the participle's verbal aspect because both sides are intruding upon the other. He provides a general rule that the more particular the referent, the more verbal aspect is seen. Particular is the opposite of general because in Hellenistic Greek, meaning nouns used to be participles, but their verbal aspect disappears. However, Wallace contends that most substantive participles still have a verbal aspect. However, keep going back with all these howevers. However, if a substantive participle carries a gnomic idea, a general principle idea, a timeless truth idea, they are aspectually flat. However, there can also be habitual action start in the gnomic idea. That's what Wallace is on another page. Wallace noted exceptions that diminish the verbal aspect of a present participle. Still, he cautions to cut the aspectual force even in this participle. So it's talking about some other resources that came out, Con Campbell and S.M. Ball and some others that came out and how they tried to clarify this a little bit more. I'll skip that part. So it uses the example 1 John 5:1 in this paper. Proponents of the position that regeneration precedes faith, which I'm not a proponent of that, have latched on to 1 John 5:1 because it contains a perfect verb, gegenetai, and articular present participle hapastuum. They argue that this means that one can only believe because they have been born again. They treat this adjective or substantive participle as if it is an adverbial participle. But if Campbell and Ball's assessment is correct, then even substantive participle has aspect. That assumes that this is not a time when the verbal aspect is reduced or absent. However, the present tense may include a gnomic idea, and one may weigh its implications. This study is not an exegetical paper, but hopefully illustrates significant implications on theology to flow from understanding the presence or absence of the substantive participle's verbal aspect. Conclusion. The substantive participle lies, and I didn't read y'all my paper, I just read the bits and pieces that apply to what we're talking about. The substantive participle lies on a verbal adjective continuum where the same grammarians will say verbal aspect is present and absent. They determine the degree present through several considerations mentioned in this paper. Where first-year grammars teach that the participle fits into three main categories, it is up to the intermediate grammars to introduce the verbal adjective continuum. However, without an understanding of advanced Greek, the danger is that one will overinterpret the substantive participle. This current student may underinterpret the substantive participle until grammarians provide more clarity for determining the presence and absence of a verbal aspect. And so in 2017, I had a video, and this was before I wrote that paper. That paper was written in 2020, I think. But it wasn't a paper. It was a sort of like a discussion / debate between me and Matt Yester on regeneration in 1 John 5:1. And so you can go find that at Academia.edu if you want more detail concerning 1 John. And also because I've walked through there and pulled out all the difficulties, all the ways that Wallace was being confusing, I guess you'd say, describing the participle and all that, just as we were talking about in the paper, and we'll continue to talk about. So in John 3:16, Wallace says this, for everyone who believes. The idea seems to be both gnomic and continual. Everyone who continually believes. This is how Wallace is understanding John 3:16, guys. Everyone who continually believes. This is not due to the present tense only, but to the use of the present participle pistuo, especially in soteriological context in the New Testament. And then you have footnote 22, which we'll talk about now. So he says the aspectual force of the present of pistuon seems to be in contrast with the aorist. And so he gives passages and everything like that. The aorist is sometimes used to describe believers as such and thus as a generic force. He says that right here, but then he says the present tense occurs 6 times as often and in soteriological context. Thus, it seems that since the aorist participle was a live option to describe a believer, it is unlikely that when the present was used, it was aspectually flat. The present was the tense of choice, most likely because the New Testament writers, by and large, saw continual belief as a necessary condition of salvation. See the theological idea he's running with? Along these lines, it seems significant that the promise of salvation is almost always given in the present tense participle, and almost never to pistusos. Apart from Mark 16:16, John 7:39, and Hebrew 4:3. Okay, so now we're going to analyze this claim. All right, first, he's basically saying participles favor continual action, and therefore this means that continue to believe. But how does he validate or verify this? A present substantive participle does occur 6 times more often than an aorist, but this could be violating the principle of single meaning. And Che quotes both his article again about this, and he's talking about illegitimate totality transfer. And he's basically, I think he's saying is that you can't transfer the present tense meaning into the aorist form in those passages. So he doesn't address the aorist right here, but he's addressing the concept. Number 2, he establishes a theological doctrine from this, right? But in the blue, he's saying New Testament writers, by and large, saw continual belief as a necessary condition for salvation. Okay? And notice he says by and large. That means there's exceptions to the rules. John uses the aorist in 439, 41, and 17:8 for genuine salvation. Hate that word, genuine salvation, but that's what we're using. At least Che's using it, so we'll go with it. Not continual belief for salvation. So, in other words, the fact that John is using the aorist tense in these passages shows that it's for genuine salvation and that you don't have to have continual belief to be saved. 3, sometimes the aorist describes believers as such and has a generic force. We saw that from him as well. And this is where that quote comes from Wallace. Normally, the present continual is because the aorist is not fitting. But is this proof to make this statement? Because he used the word normally. Okay. So this is what he says. The formal use of present and a statistic function. So basically the argument goes like this. Both the aorist and the present tense depict believers. Present participles are more common statistically for pisteuo. Therefore, believing is continuous action. But watch this, guys. You're going to see an analogy to the content that and the error creates. We're going to use the example of divorce. Both the aorist and the present tense depict divorce. The present tense occurs more common with apaluo, which is the word for divorce, in that place. Therefore, divorcing means continuously divorcing the same woman. Of course, that doesn't make sense, right? So, and we already saw that he rejected translating the divorce idea as continuous in that passage. So you're seeing that Wallace is deciding when he's going to employ the continuous idea and when he's not. And it's whenever it's sociological categories that he's assuming that continual belief is necessary to be saved, is where it's an issue. So what's interesting is the argument that I just shared with you that Che is articulating, come to find out, it leans heavy, according to the footnote, on somebody that wrote in the journal where I attend seminary. And the somebody is John Niemela, who's pretty good at Greek. That's an understatement, actually. But so he wrote a critique of Wallace's shorter grammar, the basics of New Testament syntax, an intermediate Greek grammar. And he's basically arguing that this thing is cut up and it might be good for like a professor. He used himself as an example to prepare a lesson that for an outline, and then he could add in the rest of the stuff that's in the other one. But he said that Schaeffer Seminary is going to keep using the expanded, the longer, the original Greek grammar beyond the basics, because they feel like that it doesn't equip you enough to use the other one. Okay, so here's the divorce part. Continually looking or habitually looking. Everyone who divorces his wife means repeatedly divorced, right? There's the baptism one we talked about. It says right here, the attributive present participle says nothing about either the continuation or the repetition of the action. Again, it says nothing about such matters. Keeps going on, and then you have the statement about the continual belief. He's quoting Wallace right here when Wallace is not following his own instructions. What is his validation? His note for John 3:16 says, see exegetical syntax 621. And so there's the 6 times the aorist. The generic force is this proof. There's the argument that we just saw a while ago. And it's just showing you that the critical text uses the articular present participle more often than the articular aorist participle to describe divorce. So there's the divorce argument that's in parallel to that. He's basically appealing to Wallace to be consistent rather than changing his view in the sociological context. He uses some strong language here. He says one should not play with participles or toy with the tenses to convert a free gift into a mere good deal. A good deal is no deal at all, because no sinner could even afford to pay a tip. He basically says use Wallace grammar when it's good, but when it forces the evidence, discard the bones. He talks about teaching from it. He says his book's readable, but the student needs a reference grammar to assist in a lifetime exegesis. And he says Dan Wallace always has one useful grammar, and that's Greek grammar beyond the basis. So that's the one to buy. So he's like, don't buy the short one, buy the big one. Okay, so John Niemela, you can find his work. I first became aware of him at the 2016 GES conference and you can go to Faith Alone 2016 conference, and you could find these audios, and you can see there's 2 presentations by him, and there's also PDF PowerPoints underneath. So this is what Wallace is saying about aspect here. The participle embody 2 nature, neither one acts completely independent of the other. But right here, the aspectual force is more susceptible to reduction in force. So that's the whole issue, is that when are you going to, there's times where Wallace is saying it has force, there's times when it doesn't have force. And that's what my paper dealt with. So that's back to that idea. Back to this, he assumes that the aorist was a live option, and because he didn't choose the aorist in John 3:16 and other passages and use the present tense, then that means that they believed in continual belief as a necessary condition for salvation. Yeah, that's not the right way to go. That's theological. So we need to look at what the authors wrote, not what they could have wrote. He said this is an example of special pleading, which is a fallacy, because he don't treat it the same way in Mark 6:14. And then Che also brings up that what people a lot of times call aspects really Akshasart. So, and then Wallace has even said Akshasart is not objective nor simplistic to determine. It's not easy to determine what it is. So when you're talking about participles, you have time and aspect involved, but they're dependent on the main verb. And since the main verb only has time in the indicative, then that would affect adverbial participles. But adjectival and substantival participles may not have no temporal aspect as well. That's what my paper deals with. So basically what Che's saying is this is a weak argument, and we've shown it both lexically in the previous videos. We've showed it syntactically in the last video before this, and now we've shown it grammatically in this video. So that's it. If you've been blessed by this video, its content, subscribe, hit the bell to get notifications so that you don't miss out on future content when it's live. Give us a thumbs up to let us know you're liking the content, and share it with others if you think it will bless them. Most of all, please keep this ministry in prayer. And if you feel led to donate, there's a PayPal link underneath the About section and also underneath most videos. God bless.